Anybody know Just As I Am?
No.
I do.
Maybe.
It's a typical Baptist altar call song.
Definitely. It's along with the one we did last week of Softly and Tenderly. This is the other ultimate Baptist altar call song.
Well, you weren't here last week, so that's something to do. Well, you had to be in Israel.
So,
Journey, man.
let's sing and then we will discuss. This one's also a pretty straightforward hymn. So. Just as I am without one plea, but that thy blood was shed for me, and that thou biddest me come to thee, O Lamb of God, I come, I come. Just as I am, and waiting not to rid my soul of one dark blot, to thee whose blood can cleanse each spot, O Lamb of God, I come, I come. Just as I am, thou wilt receive, wilt welcome, pardon, cleanse, relieve, because thy promise I believe, O Lamb of God, I come, I come. Just as I am, thy love unknown hath broken every barrier down. Now to thine yea and thine alone, O Lamb of God, I come, I come. That's it. There's like 4 more verses. You could do this like 1,000 verses long. But
Metal.
we only did 4 of them. Alright, just as I am, without one plea, but that thy blood was shed for me.
Oh gosh, why did you do that? God, it really hurt.
Translation?
I don't ask for anything else except that your blood was shed for me.
And that thou biddest me come to thee, O Lamb of God, I come. So I'm coming to you without any request or thought except...
And who's the one that starts it off? Thou bidst me come.
Yeah. Nice. Election. You'll be a Calvinist by the end of the year.
Except it
I
says...
think I already am, but
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Oh, I guess. No, but he says... whatever. Never mind.
Just as I am, and waiting not to rid my soul of one dark blot, to thee whose blood can cleanse each spot, O Lamb of God, I come, I come. Translation?
So it's not irresistible grace. It's just... election.
Yeah.
Because he says he comes. So he makes his own decision. So it's a little split.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and the writer of this hymn was not a Calvinist, too. Anyway, just as I am, and waiting not to rid myself of one dark spot, or one dark blot, meaning
I don't have to wait.
I don't have to wait. I don't have to try and, clean myself up because I can't. Instead, I'm just going to go with all of my dark blots and my spots because you're the one who cleans it, right? Yeah?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. Just as I am, thou wilt receive, wilt welcome, pardon, cleanse, relieve, because thy promise I believe, O Lamb of God, I come. Translation?
I don't have to try and clean myself up.
I don't have to try and clean myself up because
You'll welcome me, pardon me,
Because he
cleanse me,
promised.
relieve me.
I don't
all
have
because
to
you
do.
promised.
Yeah, there you go.
And
I
I
like the
believe.
relief part. Because the welcome, pardon, and cleanse is kind of like future, and the lead is right now.
Yeah. Just as I am, thy love unknown hath broken every barrier down. I know, it doesn't rhyme for us. It did for them. Now to be thine, yea, thine alone, O Lamb of God, I come. So why is she coming?
Because
To be thine.
his love breaks every barrier doom.
Dune, yeah.
Dune.
Yeah, she's coming to be thine, and thine alone. And the reason she's able to come, because his love is broken every barrier down. Nice. Charlotte Elliott, a Victorian hymn writer, was born in the South London district of Clapham in 1789 and died in Brighton, England in 1871.
Wow. The death date right at the beginning.
Her grandfather was a famous evangelical preacher. Her family, who belonged to the evangelical wing of the Anglican Church, taught her Christian piety. Elliott was a famous humorous poet during her youth. At the age of 32, she suffered from a serious illness that left her disabled for the rest of her life. Then her lifelong spiritual mentor, Cesar Millan, a Swiss minister and hymnologist, counseled her to replace her rage and inner conflict with peace and simple faith in God. From that day on, she turned her literary talents to writing hymns. Although sometimes depressed by her condition, she was always felt renewed by the assurance of salvation, and she responded to her Savior in hymns. By the invitation of Harriet Kiernan and the suggestion of Reverend Hugh White, Elliott became the editor of Christian Remembrance Pocketbook and published the Invalid's Hymn Book in 1834. She wrote about 150 hymns. Her most famous, Just As I Am, is widely used in English and North American hymnals today. Just As I Am, Without One Plea, was written in 1834 and first published in leaflet form in 1835. It was then published in 1841 edition of the Invalid's Hymn Book. It appeared again with the title, Him That Cometh to Me I Will Not in No Wise Cast Out, John 6:37. In the 1849 edition of Hours of Sorrow, Cheered and Comforted, in this edition, the 7th stanza was added. In 1834, Elliott moved to Brighton and lived with her brother, the Reverend Henry Van Elliott. One day, when everyone in her family had gone to a church bazaar to raise funds for a charity school, Elliott was left alone, confined by her sickness. Though depressed with feelings of uselessness and loneliness, she recalled the message, "Come to Christ just as you are," which she had received from Cesar Millan during the darkest period of her soul. Then she overcame her distress to write the hymn. Because of its simple but powerful message, this hymn has been widely used in church meetings like those led by evangelist Dwight L. Moody, Billy Graham, and John Stott. The hymn is suitable for altar calls and also during Holy Communion. Very much so, it's suitable to altar calls. It's the hymn that they use in altar calls in Baptist circles.
Her mentor's name sounds suspiciously a lot like the dog whisperer.
Actually, it was the Dog Whisperer. You know, the Dog Whisperer was actually a hymnologist from the 1830s.
Season 1. I don't know who that is. It's the Dog Whisperer. That's who it is.
Is it a TV show?
I don't know. Yeah,
It is.
it's from a TV show.
That's skills.
It's like The Nanny, but for dogs.
Stop it.
That's
All
a
right.
show. I haven't remembered that show forever.
Today, you find yourselves equal. You are all equally blessed. Name that movie again.
The Timberlands. I'm trying.
Yeah, I don't know.
They're back in the movie.
It's
Caramel.
Caramel.
It's caramel. Yeah.
But nobody actually says caramel.
It's caramel.
Of course.
Caramel.
You're weird.
There's another A there.
Somebody want to pray for us, and then we shall begin.
I pray that people will start realizing that there's another A in the word
Okay.
caramel. But you don't say that. It's weird.
You got it, Cameron?
Yeah, I can pray. Dear Lord, thank you for this wonderful opportunity to come and study your word without persecution. I pray that today would be without distractions, well, minimal distractions. and that we would all genuinely learn something. And thank you for this opportunity this day. In your name, amen.
So today we're wrapping up the existence of God and then starting into the problem of evil. Where originally I had this broken into 4 lessons, I think it can be reasonably done in 3. So we're doing 1.5 for the existence of God and 1.5 for the problem of evil. So today is the 2 half lessons. Last week we started the existence of God and we talked about the 4 major arguments for God's existence. We talked about the reason you're presenting arguments for the existence of God. All of them should ultimately be...
Shame.
Not quite. to preach the gospel. Apologetics as a whole is yes to shame, but in what context?
Defending your faith so nicely that they are shamed by their wrongness.
By their slander, yeah. Good. And what faith are you defending?
Our faith.
The gospel.
What's the gospel?
Christianity.
Yeah, what is the hope that is in you?
Reason for your hope.
Grace, you should be saved by grace
Through faith.
through faith and not through law.
Saved to what? Salvation to what? Where?
Resurrection.
Resurrection, there we go. Resurrection on a new earth. That is what the Christian faith is all about. And it's so downplayed. That's what we're being saved to. Being saved from death. The opposite of death being life, eternal life, resurrection on a new earth. That's what you're defending. By grace through faith, not by works of the law. Good. Finishing up existence for God. So basically, I'm throwing on 3 other arguments that I find helpful or at least intriguing. Like we talked about last week, some of the arguments for the existence of God I think are a little bit unhelpful. So they prove not the God Yahweh of the Bible. They just prove some higher power. That won't do. And the same is true of these, actually, as well, with the exception of the transcendental argument. But the other 2, again, they really just argue for a deity, not necessarily God of the Bible. Pascal's wager comes closer to arguing for Yahweh himself. So,
Can we real quick go over the other arguments?
yeah. So you had the moral law argument. Somebody summarize that for me. What's the moral law argument?
We all seem to follow a moral law, so there must be a moral lawmaker.
There you go. Cosmological argument.
The
Someone other than Nathan.
fine-tuning argument.
Fine-tuning or teleological argument. So,
Oh, right.
cosmological argument. Anyone? You weren't. Hannah was.
You had another...
You had something you said when you said...
Right?
I can't remember what that was, though.
It sounds like the same as the first word of the cosmological argument. So it's the...
Sort of like the clockmakers. The
Cause and
clock
effect?
in the clock in the...
No, that's still teleological.
You sure?
No.
First cause.
Something about
Yeah, cause and effect.
Yeah.
First cause.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
Okay.
Infinite
Here,
regress.
I got that
Series
clock, people.
a series of causes that go back. So what was the initial cause that caused the universe? Teleological or watchmaker or intelligent design, fine-tuning, all those under the umbrella of what's the teleological argument in summary form?
Everything has a creator.
Yeah. So the moral law you can summarize as there's a moral law, there should be a moral lawgiver. Cosmological, there's a cause, someone needs to be the first cause. Teleological is there's order, there's design, there must be someone to design it. And then ontological.
That one that nobody understood. Wait.
Actually,
Wait,
you guys were more interested in it than I thought you'd.
Wait a second. Isn't it?
I enjoyed it.
I want to try to answer. Isn't it the fact, or isn't it that we have an idea of what God is? He has to exist.
Pretty close, yeah.
Like
The idea of a
God-
perfect being suggests that a
God
perfect
is
being
I'm
the
happy
exists.
most-
with my answer.
Perfect being that could ever be thought of or conceived. So
And it is more perfect to exist than not to exist, therefore God exists.
I was close. I'm glad I was close.
Yeah, it was nice.
Because I was really like, you lost me at that point, so I was just like, I don't know what's going on, but I
I don't understand unless I'm seeing like
The steps.
The steps.
As like, and encourage you to refer back to your notes.
You should have been here, Denise. It was good.
We'll go over 3 more. So Pascal's Wager is a fun little one that I really enjoy, and it was actually really beneficial to me in my faith, and just from a sheer chances or statistical return on investment kind of idea is what Pascal's Wager is. You're getting further away.
Denise is trying so hard. Denise is trying so hard, Cameron.
Thank you.
You're making this difficult for her.
FYI, when I taught my 5th graders this morning, they were awful.
But this is what.
And you're reminding me of my 5th graders. Pascal's Wager, named for the guy who thought of it, Blaise Pascal. Physicist, mathematician. If you've done any kind of physics study, his name's probably come up. Pretty well known. There's a unit of measurement named after him, the Pascal. I forget what it measures, but
I think.
that's a thing.
Never mind.
Isn't it pressure?
I was thinking it was pressure also. Barometric pressure.
Pascal.
1600s is when he lived. Philosopher and Christian also.
Yeah, it is pressure because it's kilopascals. It's measured in kilopascals.
When he was 16, he wrote the treatise on projective geometry. He was actually died fairly young, if you do the math there. 37 or 39, I think it was. Yeah. Helped invent calculators. He invented one of the early calculators, Pascal's counting machine. It's interesting. He came up with an argument for God's existence. That this is his wording, so I'll read it. You don't have it in its entirety in his wording because I figured it would take up too much space on the page. But he was rather long-winded, and this is translated from French, so a little bit clunky to read. But God is or is not. Reason cannot decide between the 2 alternatives. A game is being played where heads or tails will turn up. You must wager. It's not optional. Let us weigh the gain and the loss in wagering that God is. Let us estimate these 2 chances. If you gain all. If you lose nothing. Wager, then, without hesitation, that he is. There is here an infinity of infinitely happy life to gain. A chance of gain against a finite number of chances of loss, and what you stake is finite. And so our proposition is of infinite force when there is the finite to stake in a game, where there are equal risks of gain and loss, than the infinite to gain. But some cannot believe. They should then at least learn your inability to believe and endeavor then to convince themselves.
I've definitely thought this before.
All right.
Yeah.
Put it in simpler terms. God either exists or he doesn't.
Nothing to lose.
One wagers with his life on one or the other. If God exists, infinite happiness awaits after death for those who wager with him, and infinite pain for those who wager against him. However, if he does not exist, nothing awaits after either death. For either. The relative cost to wagering with God to the payoff received makes it foolhardy to wage in any other way. Does that make sense? So basically, like I said, everything to gain, nothing to lose by wagering with God with your life. Rather, what you lose is some enjoyment in sitting. And that's about it. I think Pascal's wager is interesting, and it does lend itself to arguing for the God of the Bible. If you're wagering with God with your life, there's certain things that come along with that. Trusting in Jesus Christ and obeying his commands. It's all part and parcel with wagering with God. So it does argue for the actual Christian faith as opposed to some higher being. But
I've heard it described before as if you're right, no big deal. If I'm right, you're in trouble.
yeah, exactly. So yeah, that was Pascal's wager. He published in his Pensons.
It doesn't seem as much as like an argument to prove the existence of God, though. It's more of
It's just something to persuade you of why you should believe it. And the end of his argument is, some cannot believe, therefore endeavor to convince yourself. because it is better to wager with him. So he was Catholic, so he swung that way. The innate desire argument comes from really early Christian philosophers, but C.S. Lewis put it best, I think, in Mere Christianity. C.S. Lewis, professor of literature, philosopher, author, wrote over 30 books, and a professor at Oxford and Cambridge. The argument, simply put, there are no desires common to humans for which satisfaction for that desire does not exist. Therefore, the desire for God and final justice suggest the existence of God and final justice. I'll read you the section of Mere Christianity. I think he puts it a lot better and more eloquently. Creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger. Well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. Man feels sexual desire. There is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove the universe is a fraud. Probably earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. If that is so, I must take care, on the one hand, never to despise or be unthankful for these earthly blessings, and on the other, never to mistake them for the something else of which they are only a kind of, or copy, or shadow, or mirage of. I must keep alive in myself the desire to my true country, which I shall not find till after death. I must never let it get snowed under or turned aside. I must make it the main object of my life to press on to that other country and to help others to do the same.
What pages I have Mere Christianity. What pages are you reading from?
I actually don't know. I don't have the reference.
Oh, okay,
but I can
that's
find out for you at the end. Remind me to look that up at the end.
It sounds familiar with some of the stuff that he wrote in the last one.
Yeah.
The last battle.
Further up and further in. Yeah.
Or this is only like when they're looking down at Earth and they can see.
Right.
And it's only an
Only
image.
a copy.
Yeah, only an image of what it really is, or something like that. I don't remember the exact wording.
The last argument for God's existence that I want to share with you is the transcendental argument. Which this is the ultimate presuppositionalist argument for God's existence. This is the basic argument in the complicated form. I'll give you the
Hey, while you're up, can you give me a spoon? Please.
Spoon?
A spoon.
Oh.
Thank you. Shh. I asked. Sorry, Stephen.
It's alright. Here's the argument. God is a necessary precondition for logic and morality because these are immaterial yet real universals. People depend upon logic and morality, showing that they depend upon the universal, immaterial, and abstract realities which could not exist in a materialist universe, but presuppose the existence of an immaterial and absolute God. Therefore, God exists. If he didn't, we could not rely upon the logic, reason, morality, and other absolute universals, which are required and assumed to live in this universe, let alone to debate, and could not exist in a materialist universe where there are no absolute standards or an absolute lawgiver. Or in other words, all truth, knowledge, rationality, meaning, actuality, possibility, and the Bible presuppose God's existence, therefore God exists. Like I said, the ultimate presuppositionalist argument is, look, we all agree that God exists, you just don't agree. Does that track? There are no atheists. Strongest proponent was Cornelius Van Til, kind of the father of presuppositional apologetics. An interesting guy. Lots of stuff I agree with, lots of stuff I don't in his writing. And quite complex to read. But when you kind of start working out what he's saying, there's a lot to glean from his writing. Basically, that one just boils down to, look, there are no atheists. Like we talked about way at the beginning of the Apologetics series. Questions? Any of these three you want to go over or clarify? Or?
probably would if I didn't have a headache, but I have a headache, so it's not going to do me good anyway.
You just took 4 ibuprofen.
I know, and it hasn't kicked in yet.
You took it like that.
I know, it's still...
She needs more.
Well, we might actually.
Some weed.
I'm finishing early now.
Some weed and ibuprofen.
We shall see.
Maybe some. No, not cocaine.
We shall
Nah.
soldier on into the problem of evil.
Yeah, I vaguely remember that this one was my favorite from when I did that, like,
Apologetics way back when.
yeah, when I was just using it as a way to not go to big church.
What?
What?
What did you say?
Steven did this before when he was still at the church during second service.
Years ago,
Yeah.
when I was but a young lad.
Yeah.
Don't put it back in.
Back in the days of hair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Back in the days of no beard.
Yeah, that was a long time ago. Anyway, but yeah, but I was just using it as a way to not go to second service because I didn't want to go to second service. And my parents were just like, well, we can either do this or go to second service, and
Wait, what are
Steven's
you
class
talking
was
about?
more appealing.
When I taught apologetics way back when at Northwest.
You did that?
I did.
Yeah.
Problem of evil is probably the biggest or most common subject in apologetics. And the reason is because it's the most often cited objection to believing that a good God exists who wants to save and love someone. Usually when you are evangelizing or discussing God with anyone, particularly the Christian God, the response back will be something like, I could never believe in a good God because XYZ happened to me. Or fill in the blank, whatever evil you want to suggest. So we're going to try and tackle it very systematically. Start where you should start any discussion by defining our terms clearly, because that's where often these discussions get off the rails, is because we haven't defined our terms, and so you start talking about evil as some sort of amorphous or unclear thing that we think we all agree on and we don't, and you can't get anywhere because you haven't defined your terms. So we'll start with that, and then we'll kind of just get a bird's eye view of what do people generally think about this topic. And next week, we'll dive in more to all of the different theodicies. We're about to explain what that word means, or explanations for the problem of evil that people have proposed. I'll kind of give you the ones that I think are the most compelling and the ones I think are not very compelling. And then we'll do some case studies, and that'll all be next week. So today is just kind of like getting a good broad, dipping our toes in the water, seeing what's out there as far as discussing the problem of evil. Okay? Starting with defining terms. So, 4 main terms I want to define, and if there's any others that pop up, we can add this to the list as we go. But the first one is theodicy. This is a word you'll often hear when discussing this problem if you're talking to philosophy students. Otherwise, people just speak in normal English as opposed to Greek. But the word theodicy literally means God's righteousness. This comes from Greek word theos, meaning God, dikaios, meaning righteous. So they're generally used, people when they talk about theodicy or the issue of theodicy or talking about a particular theodicy, what they're saying is, what is your explanation for how God can be righteous when there is evil? Sometimes it's just used as shorthand for the problem of evil. Theodicy is the problem of evil. This is the basic explanation of the problem of evil, or stated. You've got a couple of different characteristics of God. Either God is all-powerful or not all-powerful, all good, not all good. If he is all-powerful and all good, then the problem is suffering. You have theodicy. How do you explain suffering? If he's not all-powerful, or if he's all-powerful and not good, he could stop suffering but doesn't. If he's not all-powerful but good, he wants to stop suffering but can't. And if he's not all-powerful and not good, he can't and doesn't want to stop suffering. So either God's impotent, he's not able to do what he wants to do, or he's not good. He can do but chooses not to eliminate suffering. Or he's all-powerful and all good, and there's some other explanation for why suffering or evil exists. Everybody understand the problem? This is even secular or other religions deal with this problem in their own thing. You guys know Ben Shapiro. He talks about the problem of evil often on his show, and he has a different theodicy than I do. But he's fond of saying, "Oh, you have a problem with the idea of a good God who allows evil. Maybe you haven't talked to every single religious person throughout history. They've never thought of it before." This is a very common question, and lots of different answers have been proposed. And I would suggest that nobody has exactly the right answer because nobody's God, but they're worth thinking through, at least. In particular, defining evil. What do we mean by evil? So before we go to my other 3 points, I want to kind of get your thoughts on how would you define evil?
Something that's the I don't know. Wait, that actually doesn't make any sense now.
Something that provokes emotion of a more putrid nature, I guess.
Something that
makes you
promotes a more
Provokes.
putrid emotion. Okay.
Would probably be how most people would define it nowadays.
Okay. I actually think what you're defining is closer to suffering than evil, which is a good definition. But what you just said is pretty close to what I have for suffering. But we'll get there. Other thoughts on defining evil?
Can you define it by what it's not?
Sure. Start with that.
It's not of God.
Not of God.
But I guess this is like just like.
Let's think in opposites. What's the opposite of evil? Good. Okay, so that's how we get to the not of God thing, because the opposite of evil is good. God is good. That's how he defines himself.
But if we're using this to say prove God's existence, then we couldn't use God in the definition.
Okay.
So never mind.
Well, let's talk about evil in the scriptures. Where's the first place we see it?
Probably
In the
somewhere in
Garden of Eden.
Genesis.
Yeah, where in the garden?
The snake.
What'd you say? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So this tree is the knowledge of something separate from it, but it is existent in the garden. Okay. What about all through chapter 1? God's creating things and he
It's all good.
saw that it was good, which logically supposes that there is the possibility that he might have seen that it was not good, or we might say evil. So that there's one way of thinking that many Christians agree with, and I think that they're wrong, but I would encourage you to suppose that they might be right. Don't just assume they're wrong, because I think they're wrong. That good is the opposite of evil, and like good, evil is an eternally existent opposite force. As far back as there has been good, there has been evil, would be that view. Kind of thinking yin and yang, almost kind of thing.
So, I remember back when we were doing, we were going over different theologies.
Mm-hmm.
There was the one where, that God was the Father, and then Satan and Jesus were like good and evil. The two sons.
Yeah, Mormonism roughly believes that
Mm-hmm.
that Jesus is Satan's brother, and roughly that Satan is the father of evil and Jesus the father of good. So that wouldn't be the same as what I was just describing, but that'd be another branch. Let's say God is almost neutral, and that his two sons are the progenitors of good and evil. Again, I would say that's not proper Christian doctrine, but start with the idea that evil is the opposite of good, an eternally existent opposite of good. So lots of times it'll be explained as like light and dark, where evil is the absence of light. Dark is the absence of light, evil is the absence of good. Like a vacuum kind of thing that something else enters, which is good. What do y'all think of that idea of thinking about good and evil?
Like just as a general definition for evil, or
Yeah.
I think there was like an intelligible form of evil before evil was committed,
Okay.
but it wasn't there. It was just like a theory.
So you're saying the idea of evil existed prior to evil existing?
Yes.
Okay.
And then when
And then
they ate the fruit,
evil came
evil
into being?
existed.
Interesting.
Because if God could see that something is good,
Another thing to kind of throw a kink in your thinking. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was, ESV says, formless and void. Darkness was over the face of the deep. Anybody got different translations for that, or remember from reading different translations, whatever? Somebody with the electronics, look up the King James.
Mine says formless and empty.
Formless and empty.
Same thing though.
New King James, is that?
Look up the real King James.
King James, not New King James. It's King James.
Formless and empty.
Formless and empty. What's the net say?
it was without shape and empty.
Without
And
shape and
darkness was
empty.
over the surface of the water.
What's King James say?
Cool King James.
Without form and void.
Without form and void. Oh, interesting. I would have thought that. There's a possible root for this word that would say it is chaotic.
Instead of what? Formless or empty?
Formless instead of formless. Chaotic.
So just the opposite of form.
Yeah.
It's not.
So as opposed to order, there is disorder. So this is where some people get the idea, or would defend the idea that evil. They would see this description, formless and void, darkness over the surface of the deep, as a description of an evil place that God then brings good into. So good and evil
was first.
eternally existing, evil being the absence of the presence of God. And so that would be how they defend it
So
biblically.
something being without form,
Mhm.
does it necessarily mean that it's evil?
Correct, yeah. I think that's
And
a
chaos doesn't technically mean
evil. Okay, you guys are on the same wavelength as me then. So that I do not agree with that idea that evil is some eternally existent absence of good that goes back as far as God. And so wherever God was, that was good, and wherever God wasn't, that was evil.
Could you also
Problem
say,
being, there's nowhere that God wasn't. Right? Yeah.
if evil is the absence of good, you could have, like, that's implying that something that is evil has no good. Like some, or let's say somebody who is considered to be evil has no good in them.
Right.
Does that make sense? Like,
So you're saying you could never rightly describe anyone as either good or evil unless they were entirely one way or the other.
yeah, like the good and evil can coexist. So evil is the absence of good, then nothing can truly be evil.
Right. Okay, I'm with you on that
Okay.
logic. I wouldn't use that same terminology, but I'm
Yeah.
with you. I
Okay.
understand what you're saying. Good and evil can both exist in a person at the same time.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. What I would say, evil, and I get this from Augustine, was the first one to put it in these words. Evil is the privation of good. Privation means deterioration, corruption. The analogy that I think Augustine used this one, where good is the something that exists, evil is the corruption or marring or rotting away, the privation of that good thing. So, example, I have an arm. The arm is good, but if I were to cut a big slit in my arm, the wound would be evil. The wound itself cannot exist without the arm first existing, right? But the wound is the evil that exists within the arm, is the corruption or the marring of the arm. Another example would be like rot in a tree. A tree grows, the tree is good, and when corruption comes, it rots and it degrades. The rot cannot exist without the tree. Evil is the parasite, the corruption of that good thing. I think that's the best way to think about what evil is. It's the corruption of that which is good. And so when we ask, where does evil come in the picture, I think it's in Genesis chapter 3, with the fall. It is the corruption of what God created good, and the corruption of that will towards the self instead of towards God. Like the Catechism says, what is the chief end of man? To know God and to love him forever. To glorify and love God over and above the self. And so Genesis 3, when that was switched, we're no longer loving God over and above the self. We are now loving the self over and above God. Evil has come. The corruption of humans, the corruption of the earth when God cursed it. These things come about all in Genesis chapter 3. That's what I would say is the best explanation for what evil is. It's the privation of good. I want you to be aware of both of those so you can come to your own conclusions, how you think you would define evil. But in particular, I want us to understand or to split up evil into three categories that we'll work with throughout this whole problem of evil thing. One is natural evil. So, usually thought of as natural disasters, natural decay of what is good. Examples: fragility of age, rot, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes. Things that no human directly tries to do that is evil. It just is the chaos or the bad things that happen in this world that seem to be under no one's control but God's. Does that make sense? We use the word natural evil because there's no human agent in it. A little blasphemous comic. Have you ever considered revising your plan or looking down on a tsunami and burning piles of rubble in a car crash? And so the angel's like, "Hey God, you thought about changing this plan around." This really does capture what the problem of evil, how people think of it. We think we know better than God, to summarize it that way. But natural evil, I would say, is in a different category. The things that humans don't really have control over or agency in, I think is the best way to put it. We didn't do this evil, as opposed to willful evil, sinful activity that we commit: rape, murder, greed, etc. Evil things that a person does that comes out of their character and contributes to their character. Right? That reciprocal kind of idea of becoming evil in humanity. Everybody with me on those two distinctions? So we got natural evil, bad stuff that just happens. Willful evil, bad stuff that people do. And finally, suffering, which I describe in very blunt terms as that which is uncomfortable, even extremely so, even possibly resulting in death. And I put that in a very benign kind of way. Just discomfort is suffering. That's really what suffering is. It's discomfort in an extreme to the extreme, right? It's just a question of degree of discomfort. and this discomfort could take the form of emotional, spiritual, physical, what have you. But ultimately, it boils down to discomfort. Would you all agree with that? Disagree? Suffering, would you define it some other way or adjust the definition? You said earlier, desires that of a putrid nature, or emotions that are putrid emotions, something about that.
It was more actions that provoke putrid emotions.
Okay. Suffering, things that hurt, pain, put in there with suffering, I would say need to be distinguished from evil. Would you agree? Disagree?
I'd say that suffering is the result of evil, but it's not the same thing.
Gotcha. Okay, I'd agree with that. I'd say suffering is the result of evil, but not the same thing as evil. When we get to the end of the story, both evil and suffering are done away with, right? But they're both done away with, right? It's not just one covers all of our bases. It's that they're two separate things. And I think a lot of the time when dealing with the problem of evil, we're actually dealing with the problem of suffering and asking the question, where does suffering come from? Why would God allow suffering? That's a different question than why does evil happen and why would God allow evil. Both need to be answered, but they're different questions, right?
Like the suffering from poverty isn't necessarily due to evil actions. It's sometimes just how the coin gets flipped.
Yeah, you might throw poverty into natural evil, you might throw it into willful evil, depending on the context, right? That the poverty takes.
So you say poverty isn't suffering?
No, it is, but as a result of which one?
Oh, okay.
So if we're saying suffering is a result of evil, not equivalent to evil, is it a result of natural evil or a result of willful evil? Which one are we talking about?
Can suffering be by itself is more what I was...
Gotcha.
Because, I mean, if you can get rid of evil, then why get rid of suffering? Why iterate that you're getting rid of suffering if it doesn't exist without evil?
Right. So, and this is, we might be getting off topic. I would say the reason was because of time exists. You can conceive of a time where suffering would continue as a result of evil that existed in the past and then no longer does, but suffering continues, right? Does that track? So you have to clarify, we're getting rid of both, the cause and the effect are both being done away with.
So the cause is gone, but you still have the effects from...
Theoretically. I would say both are still in effect right now. But when we get to the end of the book and he says evil and pain are done away with, he's making clear both the cause and of the suffering and the suffering itself is gone. Okay, I think, everybody with me on these terms? How we're going to use them moving forward in this discussion? Okay. Like I say pretty often, and I'll reiterate right now, the reason I always start off with defining terms is because that's where most confusion comes from, and the most clarity can be gained by defining your terms. Any argument I have, I usually end up defining terms more than anything else. Because that's where most of disagreement comes along. It's when you're using the same term in different ways. So now you guys know how I'm going to be using these terms. And I'll try and remember to say natural evil, willful evil, suffering as clearly as possible. Addressing the philosophical problem. So this is the basic problem as it exists and as it's stated in philosophical circles. If God is omnipotent, all-powerful, and omnibenevolent, all good, then evil would not exist. Evil does exist. Therefore, God is either not omnipotent, not omnibenevolent, or does not exist at all. Sometimes it's used as an argument for how God is. Oftentimes it's used as a disproof of God's existence at all. Obviously, you can see God does not exist at all does not necessarily follow from these two premises, right? Only the first two actually follow from the premises. Either he's not omnipotent or not omnibenevolent. Does that track? Because God's existence isn't in question in this whole syllogism. But I'm just pointing out the logical fallacy of people using this as a reason to disprove God. At most, you can use this as a reason to disprove God's omnipotence or omnibenevolence, but you can't use this to disprove his existence. But that's again, that's just dealing with logical fallacies, not dealing with the heart. That's the philosophical problem. And before we get into any kind of solutions, there's a great clip, one of my favorite bits of preaching I've ever heard, from Voddie Baucham, and so we're going to watch that. I love Voddie. I think he is right on point with a whole lot of what he does. To full screen. Do I have sound coming out of here?
For whom you were created.
Okay. Start at 42. So it's like 6 minutes. I love. Oh, you guys can't see this. That would be helpful, wouldn't it?
Just
Okay. So listen close. If you want to dim the lights, it's 6 minutes long, so you can actually see the guy.
My students come up to me all the time after taking a semester in philosophy. There ought to be a rule. You should not be able to talk about philosophy unless you had more than a semester of philosophy. If you haven't had any, that's fine. Talk away. But if you've had a semester, you are messed up. Be better off just not taking it at all. And they'll come up and they'll say things to me and they thought these things out. And I'm on the campus to talk about these issues and dealing with apologetics. And they want to catch me alone and ask me these questions. And they look at me and they say, I just wanted to ask you that if you believe in a God that is omnipotent and omnibenevolent, then how do you reconcile the issue of theodicy? To which I respond, took a semester of philosophy, right? Well, yes, how did you know? Because if you hadn't, you'd have just said, listen, God's so powerful and so good, how come bad stuff happens? But I'm not going to answer the question until you ask it correctly. I've worked on that all week. What do you mean ask it correctly? You're not asking the question properly. What do you mean ask the question properly? It's my question. You can't tell me how to ask my question. I will answer your question when you ask it properly. How do I ask it properly? Here's how you ask that question properly. You look me in my eyes and you ask me this. How on earth can a holy and righteous God know what I did and thought and said on yesterday and not kill me in my sleep last night? You ask it that way and we can talk. But until you ask the question that way, you don't understand the issue. Until you ask the question that way, you believe the problem is out there. Until you ask the question that way, you believe that there are somehow some individuals who in and of themselves deserve something other than the wrath of Almighty God. Until you ask me the question that way, until you flip the script and ask the question this way and say, why is it that we are here today? Why has he not consumed and devoured each and every one of us? Why, oh God, does your judgment and your wrath tarry? When you ask it that way, you understand the issue. When you ask it the other way, you believe in the supremacy of man. How dare God not employ his power on behalf of almighty man? You flip the question around and you believe in the supremacy of Christ. How dare I steal his air? Because the last breath I took, I borrowed it from him. And I'm never going to give it back. When you borrow something and never give it back, you're stealing. So you need to take a moment and get right now. The problem is me. The problem is the fact that I do not acknowledge the supremacy of Christ in truth. The problem is I start with me as the measure of all things. The problem is I judge God based upon how well he carries out my agenda for the world. And I believe in the supremacy of me in truth. And as a result, I want a God who is omnipotent but not sovereign. If I have a God who is omnipotent but not sovereign, I can wield his power. But if my God is both omnipotent and sovereign, I am at his mercy. Who am I? The crowning glory of the creation of God. Knit together in my mother's womb. Why am I here? To bring glory and honor to the Lord Jesus Christ. What is wrong with the world? Me. I don't do what I was meant to do. How can what is wrong be made right?
That was great.
Yeah.
Had me smile the first time he started yelling.
Yeah, Voddie's a great preacher. He's right here in Houston, too. So I think he hits the nail on the head there, myself. Dealing with the problem of evil, the starting place is what's funny. Merely asking that question the way we do often puts ourselves in a position of judgment or authority over God, saying, why on earth would God not fix what I call evil? Which is what the sin was. Right? She saw that the tree was good, able to make one wise, knowing good and evil. That's what we talked about last week. To put it another way, the philosophical problem of evil presupposes an undeserved and non-existent ground of good on the part of the philosopher. The philosopher asks, why do bad things happen, assuming that he himself has some merit on which to stand. Something to say that God is wrong for allowing what he allows. And in reality, he's allowing you to exist. And he should not, if your perfect world were actually enacted. Another way to point it out is, why do bad things happen to good people? It doesn't. There are no good people. Why do good things happen to bad people is the proper question. Finally, another way to put it, properly understanding the problem is the first step to evaluating solutions. So, that's kind of what I wanted to get across moving forward as we're starting to survey the field and kind of get a feeling for how do people address this problem. Make sure we're coming at it from a place of humility and recognizing that God is the one who is supreme and he is the one who defines truth and what he says goes. And often these conversations take place in a context that says we get to tell God what to say. And we don't. With me there? That said, we can go ahead and look at some of the ways that people deal with this issue. And we actually have way more time than I thought we would, so I planned to just briefly define these and go into them in depth next week, but we can start kind of fleshing them out now, and the next week we can review instead of introduce. So, how do people propose we solve this problem of evil? If a good God, all-powerful, exists, why does he allow suffering, evil to exist? These would be 5 examples that many Christians would propose, and I would say none of them I would categorize as outright wrong, and even some of them, as I've thought through my Christian faith, I've actually thought were some of the best answers to these questions, and I've started to reevaluate those conclusions. I think all of them have a grain of truth or a piece of the puzzle to help understand the problem of evil. I think really what Voddie said is the best place to start. Recognizing that it is his mercy that allows us to exist, therefore it is his mercy that allows evil, suffering to continue. So consider these and think through. First, the illusion of evil defense. I think this is by far the worst of all of the even okay answers to this question. This is the one that the Christian scientists will take, some Gnostics, old ancient heresies, and Buddhists would agree with this basic idea that evil does not actually exist. Suffering is merely an illusion. That what we think of as evil is not actually evil. It is not a thing that exists. It is merely our failure to recognize the grand workings of all that is good, and it is good that we have misascribed evil. I think, yeah, you talk to somebody who's had their limbs blown off in Vietnam and tell them your suffering's just an illusion. It's not gonna land, really. I think it's pretty obvious that evil and suffering do exist. That's the first of the solutions that I would run you through. I don't put a whole lot of stock in.
Is dilution the next one?
The next one, best possible world defense. The way this one goes is yes, evil exists, but it is necessary. Leibniz is the one who proposed this, and I'm going without notes here, so forgive me if I'm stuttering. Yes, evil exists, but the world that we currently live in is the best possible world that God could have made. So the amount of evil that exists is what is necessary to achieve the perfect end that God has in store. To an extent, I kind of agree with this when we get to next week and I start giving you my actual proposition for the solution to evil. You'll see kind of a grain of some of these in it. But
so this is like everything to follow the story sort of thing.
Kind of,
It kind of reminds me of it's all about like we talked about it last week. As long as your intentions are good. With the Calvin Hobbes comic.
I don't believe in immorality anymore.
Yeah, that was I don't believe in morality. Ends justify the means. And
ends justify the means. what kind of
Yeah, it's kind of like the end justify the means, kind of on a broad scale of existence. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Of any also from last week, the possible worlds idea of any possible world, there's X amount of evil. If you could quantify evil, the amount that exists, this is the possible world that has the least. That's why I said, like, there's a grain of this, and I think part of this is true. The problem is the way everybody puts it. Is the philosophers get a hold of it and rip it from any kind of Christian belief and make it appealing to the atheist, quote unquote, who can then justify, okay, I will acquiesce to admitting that a God exists, but I will not bow to him yet. That I think is pointless. The point of our apologetic is to preach the gospel, not to convince atheists that a God might exist. It's not even to convince atheists that God does exist. They already believe it, according to Romans. But even if they do believe that God exists, that does not mean that they submit to God as ruler. That is the goal of our apologetic. It is to preach the gospel, to give a defense of the hope that we have, resurrection by grace through faith in Christ. It does us no good to make an atheist into a theist. We must make an atheist into a Christian. Okay?
Demons believe he exists.
Or rather, a theist into
Even
a Christian.
rather a theist into a Christian. Yeah, even the demons believe and shudder, but they do not bow. So that's the best possible world's defense. That the amount of evil that exists is the least amount that God could still have created in the world and still bring about his ends. The free will defense, the one that is most common among Christians. It's the idea that, the way I used to put it, I used to find this very appealing. And I found it less and less so. God wants love. He wants humans to love him. The necessary component of love to occur is free will. For it would not be love for him to force you to love him. So he gives humans the ability to freely choose to love him.
Unless it was our natural...
Along with the free choice to love comes the free choice not to love. Therefore, if God is going to achieve his purposes of love, he must, by necessity, give the ability for one not to love, and to not love God is evil. Thus, evil is a possibility. That's kind of the free will defense. My problem is, I don't really think that humans have free will anymore. I think that Adam had free will, and Eve had free will. I don't think that humans do. At least not in the sense that the free will defense suggests. I think humans have 4 kinds of will throughout the story. You got Adam and Eve. Free will, free to do good or free to do evil. They chose to do evil. All after Adam have a will that is enslaved to sin. That's how the text describes it. You are in bondage to your sin, enslaved to your passions and desires. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, etc. So that's the natural man now. Everyone after Adam is born a slave to sin. Next possible will is redeemed, which means ability to do good, but still sinful flesh that draws towards evil. So no longer enslaved to sin, but the ability to choose to be a slave to God. And finally, the last kind of will is slave to righteousness, slave to God. When evil, suffering, death are done away with, the ability to choose to do evil will be done away with as well. So those are the 4 kinds of wills, I think, that humans have throughout human history. And all except for 2 have one of the last 3. Either slave to sin, redeemed and awaiting final redemption, glorification, or what we'll get to, glorified.
It also made it seem like, so like if God wants to be loved, it's necessary that he gives free will because it seems like it makes it seem like God is not all powerful.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, and basically that's what ultimately you've boiled it down. All of these boil down to the problem I have with them is they weaken God's omnipotence. They weaken His sovereignty. Well, let's keep going and then I'll say that. So that's the free will defense, the idea that free will is a necessary component of God's creation to achieve His purposes. Kind of the best of all possible worlds thing, but on a specific point, free will. Indirect cause defense, the idea that God is not necessarily responsible for evil. God's not the author of evil, therefore, He's still working on it, I guess. Basically, it'd say, look, yes, evil exists, but God is all powerful and all good. But He's not directly responsible for evil, and that's why it exists. And then the emphasis after that is put on He's going to fix it. He's going to be doing away with evil, so there's not really an issue here. The analogy that's used for the indirect cause defense would be like if you have a 4-year-old, you are responsible for the 4-year-old, but you do not do what the 4-year-old does. Right? So, in the same way that God created His children, Adam and Eve, they are responsible for their own actions. They're the ones who created evil at the fall, and so they are the ones responsible for it. God is indirectly responsible. Again, it weakens His omnipotence, in my opinion. It weakens His sovereignty. The ex lex defense, ex lex Latin for meaning without law or above law. So, idea for that defense is, look, yes, God gave humans a moral law to follow, but that He is not bound to those moral laws. So while He tells humans do not murder, He murders all the time. That's because He is above the law. And so the things that kind of like the illusion evil, kind of like that, He's not bound to the same morality that we are bound to. And so what we would call evil, what is evil for us is not evil for God. And so
it kind of contradicts the moral law argument.
Yeah, it does. So yeah, anybody who makes the ex lex defense for the problem of evil would not agree with the moral law argument. Or at least not agree with the solution we gave to the Euthyphro dilemma, that what is good because of God's will. Those are what I think of as the 5 most common, quote-unquote, Christian defenses for the problem of evil. And I will say up front, I find no theodicy, no solution or defense for the problem of evil fully satisfying to the question. I think anyone who does might be kidding themselves a little bit. Maybe not, but that'd be my guess. I'll go ahead and tell you what I consider the solution to the problem of evil. It's kind of a little bit of all of these. And it's this. Evil does exist. God is all-powerful and all-good and omnipotent, and He has said that He will eradicate evil. And according to this, He will. And so if He will eradicate evil and is not bound by time, then He has solved the problem of evil. He has not allowed evil to exist. See what I mean? See what I mean by it's a little bit of all of these?
So it doesn't necessarily answer the question to why it exists. Just
why it exists, just that it does, and He's in control of it. And I don't have as big of a problem with the whole indirect cause thing. I mean, yes, He was the indirect cause, but He caused the direct cause, and He is in control of the direct cause. He is supreme and omnipotent. If God had wanted to, He could have, put that in quotes, put the tree of knowledge of good and evil somewhere else, or not created a tree of the knowledge of good and evil. that allowed humans to fall and become sinful, evil. Yet he did. He's responsible. God is responsible for the existence of evil. And if he were not going to fix it, that would mean that he is not all good and all powerful. But since he is going to fix it, and indeed is fixing it, and I would say has fixed it, since he is not bound by time, by our measure of time. So from God's perspective, the problem is fixed. In eternity past and eternity future. It is only in our experience of this reality that he's given us that it is not fixed. Does that track?
So,
if he weren't going to fix it, that would make him that would make him not all powerful or not all good. But since he is, I see no contradiction with.
So when you talk about these solutions, like, are you going back to when you're defining your terms? Like, is this specifically for, like, this is including natural evil, willful evil, and suffering, or just are you including all of those?
Yeah, evil as a whole, natural evil, natural, willful, and suffering as a whole. These things, he has ordained to occur. Put it that way. God has ordained natural evil, willful evil, and suffering to occur. If he had not, it would not occur. It's kind of where I land. He's all-powerful. As he puts it when he's revealing himself to Moses, I am that I am. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy. I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. But I will by no means forgive the unjust, even to the third and fourth generation. He gets to do what he wants to do. And he is ordained. So the rest of this then is, how do we get more comfortable with the idea of evil existing, and in particular suffering? And that's kind of where the rest of this goes. And that's part of why I wanted to draw a sharp distinction between evil and suffering, because I would say that suffering, almost all throughout the Bible, is viewed as a tool of God to bring about something good. Pretty consistently. So I don't see any problem with God being the ordainer of suffering. The question of the ordainer of evil is the actual question, and he's dealing with it.
So when you say he's the ordainer of suffering, assuming that suffering and evil are dependent upon each other, or suffering is rather dependent upon evil.
Yeah.
That he is causing somebody else to do evil.
Yeah, and I would say he is in control, or I think the most unobjectionable language would be he allows others to do evil. He's still in control of it.
Yeah.
Like, I don't go so far as to say that he does evil, but he allows evil to occur and is in complete control of its occurrence. That makes sense? I don't see how you can get around that logically. He is in complete control of everything that occurs on earth, or he's not omnipotent and not sovereign, and he allows evil to occur. So he's responsible for it. God is ultimately, so that's the kind of the shocking way to put it. God's responsible for evil. Responsible for it in the same way that a parent is responsible for a child. Responsible for it in the same way that you are responsible for your dog. He is the one who has to answer for it. And he will answer for it. And he has answered for it. That's how I deal with the problem of evil. So next week, we'll go ahead and end it here a little bit early. That never happens. Well, what we'll do is, so next week I'll actually have more in-depth explanations of all of these and more in-depth explanation of mine so you can see it. I think it's always helpful if you can see something laid out. And when you first hear these, they kind of get jumbled together and don't make a whole lot of sense. So hopefully the idea being you've got your toe dipped in the water, we can dig in and sort through some of the weeds. And in particular, I want to address a couple of things back here with suffering, natural evil, willful evil. Once we come to our, whatever theodicy you find the most compelling, whatever defense you find the most compelling for the reason of evil, I told you which one I find the most compelling, the one where I kind of settled. There still comes this time of, as Christians, how do you understand and come to grips with the existence of these things? How do you, as the Apologetics says, present a defense? When somebody comes to you and points out some suffering that they've endured or some evil that they witnessed, how do you present a defense? Knowing the answer to the problem of evil isn't always as good as knowing how to explain the existence of evil and how to endure suffering that occurs. So next week, that's what I'm hoping to focus in on. How do we endure suffering? How do we encourage others to have faith in the resolution of the problem of evil? And how do we better encourage other Christians in this thing that we know will not endure forever, but presently does exist? Does that make sense? It's a tough topic. Denise is giving me the eye. I don't know if it's that she's just trying to stay awake or what.
It's that, I don't know what it is.
Okay. And I do not begrudge you at all if you find one of these other answers more compelling than the one I gave you. I came to the conclusion I did based on wrestling with the question of God's omnipotence and God's sovereignty. Where all of this starts is in the beginning God. Like, He's the one in control, so that's got to be my starting point. And these became less satisfying as I considered more heavily God's omnipotence and sovereignty and control. Another way to put it is just how big is God? As I started to realize just how big God is, I started to realize how small these answers made God. I'll also so we'll look at some case studies of dealing with suffering. We'll look at some passages on suffering in particular, since that's a big sticking point. When most people are talking about evil, they're actually talking about suffering. So dealing with suffering is a big question that I think we should look at from the text. And then that's what we'll do next week. Finish up the problem of evil.
We never did prayer requests.
We didn't. Let's pray.
We did pray.